Buonasera a tutte, a tutti, benvenuti.
Good evening to you all. Welcome. Welcome to our participants here in our C and to everyone following us online. We are very happy to see a lot of fathers because UISG deeply believes in the collaboration between religious men and women. Interculturality for UISG is a central topic. We already talked about it during our plenary assembly of 2019. This is the first meeting regarding this theme, but we are already planning some of them, some others. I want to welcome here Father Tim Norton, who already stayed here with us in the same period because we organized 2 weeks programs regarding interculturality, and I cannot welcome Sister Pat because she's already here at home because she is the executive secretary of UISG. She's not here for a role actually, but as an expert regarding interculturality in religious life. When we asked about the enrollments, we wanted also you to share some 2 or 3 questions for our speakers, and we shared them with them. And you will also be able to share something else during our discussion. As it's our custom, we are going to start our meeting with a short prayer. This text derives from a booklet which has been prepared by some congregations and by the congregation to which Father Tim belongs. I would like Sister Diana to read it.
The microphone.
We are called to live out our baptism faithfully. The Church, as the body of Christ, is made up of all the baptized persons from all over the world, Jews and Gentiles, Greeks and non-Greeks. All form one family. Christ is the head of this body, and we are all members forming one family. And our family prayer is the Our Father. We are all to be united by one faith, one hope, and one love. Furthermore, our Christian baptism is not entrance into a secret or exclusive club or sect. God's spirit of life and love continues to be lavished on all peoples and all creation. In this way, we can truthfully embrace baptism as the sacrament of interculturality.
Lasciamo che queste parole ci...
Let these words flow in our heart all over this meeting. And now we will leave you 2 minutes of silence to hear the echoes to these 2 questions.
Teresa. Lasciamo che queste domande
Let these questions question our minds. And now let us start this session with Father Tim. And we are going to reflect, as you saw in our booklet, leadership in communities and in intercultural community, which is a reality of many of our congregations and members of UISG and USG. So this is a challenge for all of us. Our speakers will talk for about 25-30 minutes, and then we will open the floor to comments and questions. As I was saying, this is not our last meeting, so we will take care of your questions so as to be able to keep reflecting upon this theme. We will also try to give you a short bibliography and send it to you via email. I'll give the floor to Father Tim.
So I will today. We can see okay? Okay. So our theme for today, leadership in intercultural communities, skills, challenges and learnings. Probably the principal reason that I am standing here with you today is not because I have done a lot of scholarship in this area. I have not, in fact. Nevertheless, I have lived in a culture that is not my first. I lived and ministered in Mexico City for 7 years. I subsequently worked in initial formation with our congregation in Australia. My first year there, I had 16 students from 11 different countries. Subsequent to that, I was elected leader of the province, which included New Zealand and Thailand. And there were 60 members in the province at that time, coming from 21 different countries. I am now living and working in the small town of Nemi, southeast of Rome, where we run our formation renewal courses for our confreres, SVDs from around the world. So we run formators courses, renewal courses, and third age courses in different languages. So I guess I'm here principally because of my own exposure to living with and trying to love my brothers from many different parts of the world. So what I have to share with you are some experiences, principally, which we shall talk about today. But, this may be an image of your congregation or your order. Perhaps you have only superheroes as members of your various congregations. I think it's more likely that we as religious in the world look like this. So we are people who are short and tall. We are people of different colors with different capacities and different limitations, different gifts. This, I think, is more like us. Mother Teresa has something nice to say about leadership and being together from different places. You can do what I cannot do. I can do what you cannot do. It is together that we can do great things. It has become reasonably clear to me with the work that I'm doing in this area that the area of interculturality and leadership, intercultural leadership, is not just a matter for apostolic communities. It is also a matter for contemplative communities. Any contemplative communities that I have visited showing me that their members are coming from all different places in the world. And I actually think that interculturality, intercultural living and leadership is perhaps more difficult for those who are with each other all day, every day. I'm with my brothers some of the time, and then I go and do something else, and then I come back to my brothers. But for contemplative religious, I think it's a complete other story. So I do feel for them and hope this may be helpful also for them. But leaders in apostolic groups and in contemplative groups are really trying to find ways to utilize our cultural differences so that our communities, in both their living and their ministry, can be more robust or stronger and more gospel-centered. So a little about leadership. Intercultural leadership, whilst I believe it has some particular characteristics that are unique, shares leadership in all sorts of parts of society. So looking at what a few different people say about leadership, Mary Kate Morse is an evangelical, she's a teacher in an evangelical seminary in the US, United States. And so she says the church art of listening to the whole and creating space for the new is leadership at its best. So I like to look at what people are saying or writing about leadership and then see how that applies to us in religious life, particularly in intercultural religious life, and in today's focus, intercultural leadership. So she talks about this church art of listening to the whole and yet being able to make space for the new in discernment, we would say, in our terms. This man is General Eric Shinseki, and he became the Chief of Staff of the US Army. And he is an Asian American. So I can only imagine how many hurdles he had to jump in his life as a soldier in a very large army that had very few people that looked like him. And yet he became the Chief of Staff. And what draws my attention as a man is this quote from him: "You must love those you lead before you can be an effective leader." And surely if we're going to talk about intercultural leadership, as leaders, one of the primary things we need to do is to learn how to love one another and how to love the people we are leading. And of course, one of my favorite people is this young woman, Malala, with a very difficult start to her education as a young girl. Many of you would be aware that she was shot in Pakistan precisely because she was a girl who was going to school. And she has become, and was a little even before the shooting, a great advocate for education for women in all parts of the world. And I have seen interviews with her. She is a remarkable young person. And this great advocacy she has for education for women. In one interview, she was sitting next to her father, and he was also part of the interview. And it was there that I learned, in part, why she is such a great advocate. Because he is. She has two brothers, and his daughter. And he was very, very keen that his daughter had access to good education, which almost cost her her life. So she says there should be no discrimination against languages people speak, skin color, or religion. A very basic way to start our intercultural lives with this basic truth. And then on to this man, Chris Lowney. Chris Lowney is was a Jesuit seminarian. He left the Jesuit seminary after some years as a student and went on to study business and did very, very well in the business world. What he brings to the business world are different forms of ethics. And so when he speaks to the business world, he uses some really interesting terms. He has taken from the McKinsey Quarterly, which is a business quarterly in the US. This was in 2015. Decoding Leadership, What Really Matters. And so they had a series of dot points about what leaders should do in business. And he has taken half of them, which is this list here, because he believes these are actually spiritual values. And therefore, I believe they are very useful for us in leadership in religious life and also for intercultural leadership. And so this particular quarterly would speak of being supportive, developing others, developing and sharing a collective mission, giving praise, fostering mutual respect, motivating others and bringing out the best in them. This one is interesting. Recover positively from failures. We know we will fail in intercultural leadership. Nevertheless, we need to recover well, have the strength to get up and try again. We need to role model values as leadership people. We need to listen to and seek different perspectives from our members. And this last one he puts in, well, it was there, review the day, that business leaders should review the day. Well, we would probably look at that as, how was God present in my day? We know about the examine. We teach it to people in initial formation. Hopefully, we have some practice of it ourselves. And then we come to something more specifically to religious life and to intercultural religious life. So this woman, Helen McBride, sadly is no longer with us, but was the Superior General of the RNDM. She died a few years ago in a car accident in France, very sadly, a few years after she completed her term as leader. So she came to our place in NAMI on 2 occasions. We invited her to talk about interculturality and leadership. She would say she has a nice short list. I like short lists. So she has a nice short list. Listen creatively. And this goes a little back to Mary Kate Morse on a previous slide. Understand the new. So when new things come up, we try to understand them. Where are they from? What are they for? How useful might they be for our mission? Model what is possible. If there is argument, unhappiness, and constant dissent in leadership teams, then other people are going to look at the intercultural leadership team and say, well, we don't want to be that. So leadership teams certainly have an obligation to be modeling what is possible in intercultural life and ministry. And she says the one thing that we don't do enough of is rejoice. And I think she's right. That so often we will look at our differences as problems, when in fact, if we turn the mirror around, we can actually look at it as something to be happy about and rejoice in the very fact that we are different. And like Mother Teresa says, that means that I can do some things well and you can do other things well. And if we can actually do something together, we can utilize both our skills and our gifts. And that's to be rejoiced. Helen would go on to say, it's important to think about culture and difference in a broad sense. So we don't just think of ethnicity and nationality, but we might think about differences in generations, differences in gender, and even differences in personality, all of which have their own cultural characteristics. And she says that leadership, intercultural leadership, is to help communities understand and recognize their differences. and to then deal with those differences in gospel-centered ways, which make the community stronger, not weaker, but stronger for the mission. And she finishes by saying, leaders are called to be good listeners to those they are leading and to the Spirit that guides. So the Holy Spirit, this Holy Spirit that we pray to, that we believe in, the Spirit of God is with us even in our intercultural lives, and especially in our intercultural lives. So just a piece of scripture from Corinthians 12. So with interculturality, we can look at what people say about leadership, we can listen, and we can then bring it to our intercultural communities and ministries. We can even look at different biblical passages with an intercultural lens. So here we have those members of the body that we think less honourable, we clothe with greater honour. And our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. Whereas our more respectable members do not need this. Meaning to say that in our intercultural lives, leadership should have a particular focus on the minorities. So we know a lot now about the option for the poor, and we continue to believe that and live that. But the minorities in our religious orders are often living different levels of poverty. So minorities in language, minorities who are in age, generation, minorities who have particular ethnicities or particular backgrounds. I believe is it up to leadership to really spend time and discernment on the minorities within the group. Now, interestingly, those minorities one day may become majorities. So we are 6,000 in the world, 6,000 SVD, brothers and priests, and we are now 1,500 Indonesian-born brothers and priests. And so that group of people in our group is now the majority. And interestingly, mistakes of the past of cultural majorities, at least in my experience, it's quite easy for those mistakes of the past to be committed in the present and in the future by new cultural majorities. And so we all have to have an eye open to this, to be in conversation and awareness with each other so that we aren't repeating the same mistakes of the past. You would have seen this as a way of thinking about culture, the iceberg. And in any workshops I've done, I've asked, has anyone ever seen an iceberg? One woman once said she had. Nevertheless, it is an image that we understand. That part of the iceberg is visible above the water, and the larger part is not visible to us, like culture. So the part we can see is the external culture. And I tend to think about our 5 senses, what we can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. And for those things, at least, I would bring us to the idea of community meetings. Now, I'm aware that, at least in male religious life, many communities have given up on community meetings. Now, if communities are receiving new members, my belief is communities are obliged to have regular meetings because it's one of the best places for the new person to learn. And so the new person is probably going to be different in age, probably going to be different in cultural background from the majority, and has a whole lot to learn. And community meetings where we talk to one another can actually be a great learning place because the new member learns, even if they are learning language at the time, the new member learns, how do we converse with one another? How do we relate to each other? What do we talk about? And possibly more important still, what do we not talk about? And so we have communities in the world where 4 or 5 men are living in a community environment, in a country, not one of them is a resident of that country, was born there. And so what do they use as norms? What do they eat? How do they work out how to pray? What do they wear? So the idea is to open the window, open the door, and look outside and see what local people are doing. How are they praying? What are they wearing? What do they eat daily and when they have fiestas or parties? Now, the internal culture, which is clearly more complex, attitudes, belief patterns, values, myths. So this is the part below the waterline of the iceberg, much harder to get access to. And quite often, it is used, consciously or unconsciously, by the community that is receiving newer people. When newer people ask, why do we have morning prayer at 5:30? Could we have it at 6:30 maybe? No. Why? Because it's always been done this way. Which, those ideas of cutting off the conversation for the newer people is not good leadership. We should be opening up conversation and ready to hear different views. So, who's the leader in this image? Is it the one at the front or is it the one at the back? Depending on your style, it could be either. The job of the leader or leadership group with all of those hidden characteristics down below the waterline on the iceberg is to help a community bring those to a conscious level to talk about, to help them have robust discussion about the things that they normally don't talk about. Because particularly for new people, they need that information. They need to be part of conversations. And a word around intergenerational communities. You'll notice from the image that the older woman has the cell phone and the younger person has the phone or the landline, the telephone. And so, new religious that are moving around from one community to another are normally the younger people. And our more senior people will often characterize them in terms of their nationality or their ethnicity and say, oh, they are like this because they are from Peru or Hong Kong or Togo, when in fact they are like this because they are young. So they bring a whole generational aspect with them. And so as we know them now as generations X and Y. So if we look quickly at Generation X, now the actual years that Generation X were born are perceived differently in different environments, but I'm taking these years from 65 to 79. And if I go to Wikipedia, I will get a number of characteristics of Generation X. Ambitious, eager to learn new skills, seek fun, thrive in meaningful work for the benefit of humanity, want training and feedback, are more skeptical, so they ask more questions than previous generations, but they value authenticity. And they embrace social diversity right across those particular areas: race, generation, sexual identity. So when I ask any group, is this good for mission? Mostly people say, well, yes, it's okay, it's good for mission, why not? Why should we not use those things for mission? Generation X. Generation Y, 1980 to 1999. So similarly, looking at just at Wikipedia, what are some of their characteristics? They want regular feedback. They need to know they're doing a good job. And they want to know if something's going wrong. They face new ideas as opportunities for learning, and they require clear expectations about what is wanted and flexibility to determine how to get there, and they thrive when work is relevant and important. So again, why would these not also be good for mission? If we have people coming into our respective congregations with these qualities and characteristics, let's use it for mission. My sense is that those of us who are a little more senior in religious life, if we look at number 3, require clear expectations about what is wanted. So I think from my generation and older, most of us were given tasks. It may be superior of a community, it may be leading a health facility, it may be leading a parish, and we were given very little information about how to do that. And often that was in a cultural circumstance that was completely foreign. And I think religious life is famous for that. We just go out there and try and do what we can. So we don't necessarily inform each other well as we move into new situations. Generation X and Y, as I am coming to know them, will not accept that. They want more information, even if, at least if their goals and aims that we may not actually reach, we may go in other directions, the Spirit may lead us elsewhere, and that often happens. But they do want a lot more information than we normally are prepared to give them. Why? Because we have to sit down and think about it and pray about it. Intercultural leadership with younger people. So their challenges for X and Y, generations X and Y, are great. So they leave home in a very different way to the previous generations that left home. They leave home expecting regular virtual contact with home. And sometimes that can be a good thing. But leadership needs to help young people bring this term called discipline into their lives in all aspects of our life. It's very common in religious life. But leadership helps them bring discipline into this. How often do I speak to people at home? How often do I Skype? Well, if it's every day, it's a problem because you've arrived physically, but you haven't arrived emotionally. You're still at home. And at least from what I can gather, generations X and Y, because of the use of social media, cell phones, Instagram, Facebook, are now communicating across geographical boundaries and are communicating in certain ways that are common to their generation. There has never been another generation that had so much in common across national boundaries, across ethnic boundaries. And this means something for us as religious. I'm not sure what yet, but I think it deserves consideration. There's lots of positives in this, but there are also lots of possible negatives. So we know that they competently use their internet to source information, study, education, but they are very good at resourcing entertainment. Me and my generation, I don't think we're very good at all. So there's things to learn. Continuing these challenges, we know they're vulnerable to addiction on their social media. I am actually a trained physiotherapist, and I know that they have very bad posture sometimes, and they suffer from obesity if they sit too long at their desk and their computer. One of the issues is that some of them would prefer to have virtual relationships than face-to-face. And so there are times where we have to get them out of their bedrooms and move them into social situations, ministry situations, even against their will. If they continue to say no, they need to go home. They need to go home. Difficult decisions all around, but there has to be a line where we meet and say, we've come this far, you either keep coming with us or else you need to return where you came from, wherever that was. Leadership. So what might we use for programs for intercultural leadership, particularly with our younger people? We might talk about power differentials, intercultural conflict. How do we treat employees in different cultural circumstances? What are our relationships with our ministry partners? And we certainly, as men, and I suspect as women, need to continue to do work on professional standards. How to be with children, how to be with young people in ways that are safe for everybody across cultures. That in itself is challenging, but possible. And we need to continue to take risks as people took risks with us. We need to be strong and firm and generous and faithful in taking risks with our younger people from places that are not ours, from other parts of the world. As it says here, taking risks in ministry with newer, younger members that are calculated, creative, consultative, intelligent, and intentional. Interculturality requires a degree of intentionality. We need to keep thinking about it together as we move forward. Sure, we need to take risks with our younger people, our newer people, but we need to use our brains, our hearts, and our spirits. We don't leave them at the door. And as I think I've mentioned, the places our younger people are going, the communities that are receiving, if they're going to receive, they need to do something so they deserve to receive new people. If new people arrive and they say, welcome, here's your bedroom, and our evening meal is at 6, see you then. And we're fairly good at that. We often don't give them much more, but they require some level of mentoring that somehow was not so required in previous generations. If we're not prepared to provide it, we should not be receiving them in the first place. Leadership, I think, needs to really help receiving communities take their responsibility seriously of receiving new members, particularly if they are from outside the dominant culture. It's not all up to the new person. The receiving communities do bear some responsibility, and there is joy in this if you really work at it. Difference. There's lots of joys and challenges in this. Culture requires this disciplined and regular consideration by new members and the communities that receive them. Certainly, there are higher levels of accompaniment and mentoring that are required. So newer members have this enormous potential, and it's up to leadership to help unlock that potential using social media as needed, because it's there to be used for mission. And we have not done enough work in that area really yet to be working that well as congregations and religious orders in the world. And so we finish with leaders are called to embrace intercultural dynamics among their members and to take risks for the mission that are intelligent and supported. Because the reign of God is coming to us in different places with different faces. Thank you.
Grazie Tim per averci aiutato a...
Thank you, Tim, for having helped us to understand who is an intercultural leader. I'm wondering if there are other leaders. Maybe leaders should be always a bit intercultural. And echoing what you were asked by participants here, I feel that we have a desire to go from a description of interculturality to a sort of real insight for strategies, processes, and even exercises, because this is an ongoing learning which is not definitely learned. Some others were talking about intergenerational challenges, and something that touched me was also the possibility of healing wounds between peoples whose representatives maybe are part of the same community or of the same reality. Some congregations talked about having a tutor inside the community, listening and watching for that care of details in interculturality which actually make the difference. Well, I believe we have a lot on which to reflect, and I would like to propose you a small break before leaving the floor to Sister Pat. And here I'm asking you, both to people online and to you here in our room, to highlight what impressed you more, because afterwards we will talk all together. 1 minute.
Bene.
Well, afterwards we will have another short break. We are very happy to communicate to you that we actually finished our possible places for the streaming. So we opened up the platform on Facebook. So we understand that this team is particularly interesting for religious men and women. So I'm going to leave the floor to Sister Pat.
Good afternoon. I'm going to demonstrate diversity by sitting. And I suppose, first of all, I should say that I'm reflecting on this theme from the perspective of my own experience as a woman religious. And my entry into this journey began with a chapter commitment taken in 1998. And then I began myself a study of the theme at CTU, Catholic University in Chicago. So I had 2 years to reflect on the theme. At the same time, my own experience of living in an intercultural community, particularly as a member of the General Council over an 8-year period, and my experience with solidarity with South Sudan, an intercongregational, intercultural project in South Sudan, and more recently, a similar type project of sisters who come from different congregations working and living together in Sicily, and none of them from Sicily. So this has led my reflection and my search, and I suppose I would have to say from the beginning that it's a journey. And I'm very struck by the phrases that I think we need to take into our consciousness. McGaffin talks about the flourishing of luxurious human diversity, and we see it in our communities. And others talk about a bewildering diversity, because in a way we have to acknowledge the complexity of this area. But I'm very caught by Marie Chin, Mercy Sister in the United States, who talks about the labyrinth of cultures in religious life. So in a way, we're walking through a labyrinth, and it's a journey of learning, and it's a journey of discovering our own limitations, but also our own growth in the area. So often people say, why the focus on interculturality today within religious life? And I think the document, the more recent document, New Wine in New Wineskins, talks very clearly, particularly in relation to women's congregations, of a change in terms of moving from monocultural to multicultural, which means there are many cultures in the same community. But knowing that there's something more, that in a sense, in living in this diversity, we're called to a way of transforming each other. And there's a new awareness of the significance of culture. I think certainly when I entered religious life in 1965, the focus was on uniformity. So in fact, what we were doing was we were obliterating difference. And now I think we've come to a new appreciation of the significance of culture and the significance of cultural difference, and in a way, the showing of unity in diversity. I'm also aware that we've come to the point in many congregations of acknowledging past failures and the need for healing. Because at times, if you like, the dominant culture of the congregation really had impact in different parts of the world. There was an imposition. As a congregation rooted in Ireland, I often said we were cultural colonizers. We wouldn't like to describe ourselves as such, but we brought our culture with us. So there's need for healing, because in certain cases that cause hurt and division. But also I have become very, very aware that we can tell old stories forever. In other words, I had the experience on one occasion of working with a congregation who were telling of the past experience with a particular group of sisters who would have come from a different culture. And I said to the younger ones, did you ever live with these sisters? And they said, no, but the older sisters keep talking about it. So we can pass on the bad experiences of the past. So this challenge to learn to live with diversity, I've been very challenged myself. One of my first ministries was in Northern Ireland. And there, the whole challenge of healing and appreciating diversity, we were living it out in that particular context. And yet Tim used that lovely reflection from Corinthians, because we're getting new theological and spiritual insights about interculturality. Think of the story of Ruth and Naomi, or the journey of Abram and Sarah into a new territory. So we can begin to read the scriptures with the theological lens. But I'm convinced above all that each one of us, but particularly as leaders, we have to acquire an intercultural competence. And that's, I think we need to emphasize three aspects of that. We need knowledge. You actually have to study this area. You have to read about it and reflect on it. You have to look at cultural frameworks and see what they have to teach you. We have to look and appreciate the difference, the perceptions, the values, the beliefs, the behaviours and practices of peoples from different cultural communities. And then we have to learn how to shift our behaviours. I'm learning to shift some of my behaviours here in Italy. So if I'm living in an intercultural group, the more I understand, the more frameworks I have to understand the dynamics that are happening, the more I will appreciate the attitudes, the beliefs, behaviours, the practices of others, the more I will shift my own behaviour. Because I believe it's a matter of justice and right relationships, but it's also a prophetic sign and witness in today's world. If we can show that we who are different can live together and celebrate and hold differences in unity, we're showing something to today's world. I always remember in South Sudan, while the people appreciated that we were with them, teaching them how to be teachers, nurses, and midwives, and so forth. But they mostly said again and again, how can you from different tribes live together? So the witness and the presence of difference, of unity and diversity, was enormously significant. You know, culture is the air we breathe, and we only notice it's gone when we move somewhere else, in understanding our own culture. And it's a set of norms, the way things are run or simply are in a particular society or group. And all of our congregations have their own cultures, but hopefully too they have their own subcultures, where the expression of the congregation is different from place to place. And it's allowed to express itself in that diversity, because that enriches, in a sense, the vision and inspiration of the founder or foundress. So a cultural identity, and we have it, each of us, it's the social group or groups to which we belong, because we can have several identities which give us a sense of belonging. But it's more than that. It's the why of your being. I think our cultural identity is something that's so intrinsic to us, that's an area of our being that can be easily hurt or damaged. You know, who we are, it's part of who we are, our essence as persons. Now, Tim referred to the iceberg. And I think when we look at the iceberg and we look at what's above the water and what's below the water, there are many aspects of culture that we don't talk about whatsoever. So we need to look at different frameworks. And if you pick up any book on interculturality, they will present different frameworks. I've just named, taken this one from Harris and Moran. And they name 10 cultural categories which they say global leaders should understand. And they're not referring to religious life at all. These are the kind of things we should be having conversations about. Where do we get our sense of self? How is space dealt with in culture? Space is dealt with very differently in different cultures. When I name the next one, dress and appearance, you'll see why that is a very significant discussion in religious life, when we dress differently or dress differently from place to place. Time and time consciousness. We often talk about stretchable time or monochromatic time, measured time, and the challenges that that brings. I remember somebody saying to me in a particular cultural context, the meeting begins when all the people who should be here are here, not at 9 o'clock. So it's something we have to learn and appreciate. Values and norms, the mental processes. We don't process information in the same way. And that's been one of my biggest learnings. And so we have to give the time and the rhythm and allow people to process as they will. Communication and language, and the struggle of language, and how we communicate is different, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. Food and feeding habits. I had the experience in the past where a lack of flexibility in dealing with the whole question of food actually divided a community. There were young people whose dietary needs were much different to, might I say, the meat, vegetable and potatoes of the senior sisters in the community. But if that area isn't negotiated and space made for difference and diversity, food is liturgy, it's ritual, it's very important to our way of being. They seem small things, but you see, in the past we expected those coming in to accept what already existed, rather than look at how can we change and learn and grow and create the space. Work habits and practices, different rhythms, different expectations. So I often ask myself, do we really know one another from a cultural perspective? Do we really know the other? And I think there was a basic assumption, certainly in women's religious life, that if we lived together, then we'd get to know each other culturally. Somehow it would happen through osmosis. It doesn't. It's a task to be undertaken, and the leader is very important in this task. So I think both personally as a leader, and then in the context of communities, individual communities or the congregations, the first is we need to be open to learn and to plan learning in a systematic way. So that could be workshops, a program, what do we do in our formation programs or ongoing formation. So ways in bringing about a deeper understanding of the other that is a mutual enrichment. So through our reflection together, our conversations, giving cultures opportunities to share and explain aspects of their life, we learn, we grow. I think we have to be honest and examine our personal prejudices and our stereotypes. One of my learnings in working in Northern Ireland was that the literature would tell us that we learn our prejudices by age 7. So we already come with a sense of who's the insider and who's the outsider. Who's the acceptable one and who's the stranger. So as a leader, I think we have to examine those dynamics of our personal, but also maybe our congregational stereotyping and ways in which we have harbored prejudice. Can we nurture and appreciate diversity and really welcome mutual transformation? So in my experience, there are different ways of getting to know one another. For example, this intentionality that Tim spoke about, so that we organize meetings where we share and prepare, not in a, that we design an exercise or we have a workshop where we really share about things that are important. I remember doing an exercise in community where we were asked to remember what it was like to be at a family meal when you were 12 years of age. So we all looked back to when we were 12 and described the whole dynamics of a meal. Where people sat, what food was prepared, how people sat, how people ate, who served, and so forth. Now that in a sense revealed so many aspects of culture. We could do that about other aspects of culture, like how do we celebrate a marriage? What are funeral rituals like in our different cultures? But this is a way of intentionally learning about the other, not just picking it up in passing when we share a table, because it's not something we all share necessarily together. A very helpful way is to undertake a cultural audit at the level of a congregation. Now, what's a cultural audit? It's some way of asking the members of the congregation what has been their experience of life in the community or in the congregation at the level of their cultural selves. And in the context of one congregation who did this, I will just share some of the outcomes, because what was very interesting was when you invited feedback like that from the congregation, people answered very honestly, and their responses were put together. And then that particular booklet was used as a reflection tool within the whole congregation. So here were some, this was a women's congregation. So here were some of the responses from sisters when they were asked, what was it like at the level of culture? A sister from an immigrant family said, while most of the community are warm and welcoming, some of them are very hard to accept me in the way of my English speaking and culture. I try very hard to speak like them, but my tongue couldn't do it well. So that gives a real understanding, because sometimes we're very intolerant with people learning a new language, or we constantly correct and make people feel inadequate. What I really appreciate about my own staff here at UISG, with my poor attempts to speak Italian, they never correct me, but if I listen well, I hear how I should have done it. So there are lovely, graced ways of accompanying one another. Another sister said, living in a predominantly white community, she said, while others say I don't see colour, while the remark is well-meaning, I don't find it helpful, as colour is an essential part of who I am. So reflection on that, even on that alone, at the level of community, can bring out really our whole approach to race and racial difference. Another sister said, living in an intertribal, interracial community is hard. You can't identify the contents until you scoop into the pot and taste them. So in other words, again, using what Tim said earlier, we have to taste, we have to use our senses well in entering into the culture of the other. I think sometimes, if I reflect there, we think that sharing our different foods is kind of enough on a multicultural evening to get to know one another. We remain at we can remain at a superficial level rather than entering into really meaningful conversations about ourselves at the level of culture. A sister living far from her home culture said, I fear to lose my identity, and I regularly visit an elderly gentleman as an excuse to compensate my craving to hear and speak my mother tongue. So just where are the spaces when members of our communities or our congregations can be among their own, so as to speak? I think that's also important. Finally, I find this one very challenging. A sister shared how hurt she felt when community members from other cultures criticized aspects of her culture, saying, yes, we practice communal work, speak using diminutives, and our favorite color is black. We believe in evil eye, souls, black magic, enchanted places, ancestors, dreams, and premonitions. It's a real reminder of how we can react in a very facile way to aspects of cultures not our own. And our need to enter and understanding the complexities of a culture. So understanding cultural knowledge involves understanding the norms and the communication rules of other cultures so that we can interpret one another accurately. In many ways, we can misunderstand because we interpret through our own lens. You know, a shake of the head doesn't mean the same thing in every culture. The use of words even, and we can presume even in a monocultural context that we understand. I remember my first teaching position in a part of Ireland, and one of the teachers kept saying, her parents are very annoyed about a certain matter. And I couldn't understand the significance of the word annoyed, because it didn't mean that they were angry. But annoyed in this case meant they were worried, they had a real concern. So within my own cultural context, I have to learn the language, learn the significance of phrases. So in my own reflection and study, I identified 9 lenses for understanding culture. And I'm not going to burden you with 9 lenses today. So these 9 lenses that in a sense we have to understand as leaders and as members, because I think we all go on this journey, is the importance, first of all, of context. I'll say a little bit about that. The importance of how we self-identify. And in the third one there, the importance of how we look at power and authority. Now, there are others that can remain for another day. So I'm just going to quickly look at the question of context. And we know that these in a sense are frameworks. They're not black and white. They show, if you like, a leaning towards that some cultures are low context cultures and some cultures are high context cultures. And if I look at a low context culture, the meaning or communication is through words. Often rituals are few and they're informal. An approach in communication can be quite impersonal, and information can be abstract and factual, and the thought process is very linear. And in a high context culture, it's directly the opposite. The context, the environment, the feeling, the atmosphere is extremely important. There's a much more formal approach. There's extensive ritual. Their relational values are very important. Body language, the role of silence in communication. And then in low context culture, It's easy to engage in direct confrontation and conflict. In a high context culture, you avoid direct confrontation and culture. Now, I'm looking at this area in particular. It's probably the only one I look at today because it's about communication. And this really was a learning that has helped me enormously in my role, in my leadership roles. Because there's a difference in communication styles between these two cultures. In a high context culture, the message or the communication is either in the physical context or it's internalized in the person. Very little of it is coded, meaning spoken. There are words, but in the communication event, I have to take the whole context into consideration. Now, those from a low context culture, low context communication is directly the opposite. The message being conveyed is explicit, it's verbal, and it's often highly elaborate. So talk, 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 talk. Right? So this understanding from Edward Hall I find helpful. He says, when communicating with another person, something which is on his or her mind, a person from a high context culture will expect the interlocutor, the person listening, to know what's bothering him and her. So will not explain in great detail. Instead, he or she will go round and round the topic, providing all the pieces of the puzzle, except the final central piece. And the role of the listener is to place the final piece of the puzzle in the center and interpret the event, so to speak. Now, if I can give you an example. I remember being involved in a consultation. And in that particular consultation, the sisters were giving an answer, right? And many of them were repeating the same answer to the question. But there was no energy. Body language was, person maybe was very little eye contact, and the posture, so that there was no energy around the event. So if I come from a low context culture, so if I'm interpreting that, what would I say? Well, they're saying this, so they must mean this. But if I interpreted the whole event, I said, with their words, they're saying this, but everything else is saying something different. When I returned some years later to that province, they said, you listened very well. But it was interpreting the whole event. Those of us from a low context culture have to learn to stay silent and be quiet on occasions. We talk too much. Often our extroverting is in order to clarify our thoughts, but we can get in the way of the communication event. So I love these. The Institute of Plain Speaking. We had a meaningful confrontation and I lost. Or body language. One of my big learnings in working in teams is that those from high context cultures have a wonderful intuitive sense. that we need to pay attention to in our group work, but if we're not quiet and silent enough, we don't give space for the person to share. So some of my general observations in finishing. Communication is deeper than language. We have to pay attention to context, and I need to know my role in the communication event. Am I responsible for understanding the communication, or is the speaker responsible for the communication? It's a difference. And then the whole question in many cultures that it's not acceptable to question or disagree with an elder. So those of us who are elders need to be creative in actually mining the truth of what's really happening. In some cultures, what I understand as a yes may actually mean a maybe, or a not yet, or this is what you want to hear. You know, so again, the interpretation, building trust then and openness requires time. I think we have to understand and have conversations about how best to maximize our communication. And as leaders, we have a role in that. And then maybe I'll just end by saying, because I want to give time for questions and for your reflections, is the whole role of formal and informal in context. Often in cultures, there are very formal ways of organizing events or in presenting or in welcoming. And then the visitor may come from a very informal context, from a culture that expects things to be very, very informal, and vice versa. And these things, and I've heard people saying, oh, I don't want all this fuss and bother. But all this fuss and bother is an essential part of the culture that you're entering. And not to accept that can actually cause hurt and misunderstanding. So I suppose my few words this afternoon have just been to open up some of the journey of this, of our growing in our ability to be intercultural, to enter into the space and place of the other, to be changed and mutually transformed, and together in our diversity, to mirror a new way of being in communion and of encountering one another as a prophetic witness in today's world. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sister Pat. Thank you both for having given us this insight. And the more I listen to you, the more I feel that interculturality is a life experience, a very complex path, and that goodwill is not enough, but we need to be trained and to be skilled, that we can build in our religious life, but not only in our work life, because Tim, for example, was talking about contemplation and the Holy Spirit in a moment in which we recognize the others to be bearers of God. So this is an even deeper level. So I feel that even for our interpreters, this could be the right time to have 10 minutes in which we can talk in groups for those who are here in the room. Whereas for people following online, you can think about the questions you want to ask, and then our colleagues will read them. You can write them in chat, or you can ask to enter the floor, because our technical structure makes it possible to show our online people. So we will have 8-10 minutes to discuss at tables, and then we will share experiences, comments, or questions.
Avete ancora un minuto. Aspettiamo le nostre traduttrici.
You still have 1 minute.
Vous avez un minute. Già, c'est tout. Per le persone che ci seguono online,
For people following us online, we can see that you have been already sending some comments and questions. We will try to answer every comments and questions.
bene, piano piano riprendiamo.
So we're going to slowly start again.
Ci sono delle domande che ci sono arrivate.
There are some questions online which would require a week to be answered. So we're going to read some of them. promising you that we will not lose others, because as we said before, we will have other meetings regarding this topic, or maybe some other formulas to answer these questions in a different way. So technology is helping us a lot. I'm going to read some questions from online participants. Spanish. How can we accompany a community to be integrated, to value and accept another culture? In this moment. How can we overcome the stops inside an intercultural group? In Italian, could a leader become a person ruling if he or she does not learn the values of leadership? We need to be trained to be leader and to be intercultural leader. Is this true? Is it possible to live intercultural diversity only when we are able to accept ourselves as we are in order to better understand ourselves? Now, this is a statement actually. It is possible to live interculturality only when we accept ourselves as we are. Spanish. A question for Pat. Could you please explain us the concept of the right relationships? In French. How can we create an intercultural space pertaining to all? We are going to read some other online comments afterwards. I believe that all comments rotate around the same question. Now I would like to give the floor to people here in the room. If you want to make comments or ask some short questions, to ask a question, to speak, you need just to push the button in front of you. I would like to ask you to tell us in which language you are going to speak and tell us who you are and which is your congregation.
Do I have to introduce myself? Yes. Yeah. Ador Castillo from the Congregation of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I'm from the Philippines. My question is this. I would like to address this question to Father Tim Norton, right? Father Tim, you were from the SBD and you mentioned that in the SBD are more than 6,000. And right now there are 1,500 Indonesians. In the beginning of your congregation, as is most congregations, like my congregation from Belgium, yours, I guess, Germany, the beginning is, I guess, Europeans or Germans in majority. And you mentioned something like we have to learn the mistakes from the past about, the rule of the majority, especially, the times when it is a kind of monocultural congregation, but now it's intercultural or multicultural. So is there a hard and fast rule to avoid the mistake of the past? That now that in the most congregations now, it's more the other nationalities, like in your congregation is the Indonesians. In some congregations, it's Africans or Asian who are now in the majority. So how do we now avoid the mistakes of the past? Whether there's a hard and fast rule to do that.
Yo soy misionero escalabriniano y brasileño.
I am a missionary from Brazil. We talked about context and about the novelty, the cultural and historical novelty. Because in history, there are things that we believe in and that are very important for us, but we do not know these new elements from the histories of others. So how can we integrate the elements, the histories and beliefs of the others with ours?
En français, Micheline Kenda de la Sainte Famille de Bordeaux.
My name is Micheline. And it appears to me right to say that what you said before, and you talked about blocks and obstacles that could reach us, and some mistakes that we pass on to history and to the future, because people are categorized and it has always been like that. So how can we process this different approach today, comparing history with people who are or not responsible for that, because these aspects involve the people, history. So how can we deal with these problems? And another thing that I appreciated is that today we understood the need of coming in contact with the issue of culture. So I would like to thank you for the moments of sharing.
Ci sono altri?
Are there any questions or comments? I think that we have lots of material to be dealt with. Yes, please, Father. My name is Father Mwanda from the Congregation of Mary. I would like to thank you for everything you said, but also for having shared with us your experience. My question rotates around the mission. You talked about the perspective, the creative perspective in working with younger groups. Growingly, the missionary perspective is decreasing, and it is for this reason that the church pushes towards an exiting church. But how can we reconcile the tones, the different tones coming from different groups in order to move forward towards either the mission and the missionary passion, but also respecting everyone's rhythm? Thank you.
Bene, lascerei adesso.
Now I would like to give some 5 or 6 minutes to Pat, her team, to give us some time for reflection. I will give the floor to Tim.
So there is a serious variety of questions here. How to overcome some of the blocks that we find in our communities for a variety of reasons in order to move forward as a community, in order to better understand our mission. It is, I think, useful to remind ourselves that all of us, by nature, by being human, we are all ethnocentric. It's quite normal. That's how cultures in the world have not just survived, but thrived. They have actually thought that there is something about their particular culture which is actually better than others. And in its more exaggerated forms, it becomes racism and leads to serious conflict. But it is basically a very natural part of us. And I believe it's an important part for us to explore with one another. Because within that sit then some of my prejudices. Someone asked me, how do we help a community work with their prejudices? Well, first off, we have to work out what our prejudices are, because many of them are unconscious and we are not aware of them. Until such time as we do some dynamics with each other and share some experiences of learning, and it is there that we start to really learn a little more about ourselves. So self-learning, as it is in the spiritual life, self-knowledge, is critical, I think, to this process. Otherwise, we are constantly projecting onto other people. So one way of actually addressing our blocks is for us to share more about ourselves, to understand ourselves better, individually and then together. So that sense of ethnocentrism, we actually, I think, need to cultivate in one another as something healthy, to understand ourselves well, and to then help others understand us as well. But if we don't understand ourselves, how do we expect anybody else in our community to actually understand us? So we have an obligation to both deepen our self-understanding with regard to culture, and then to hopefully, in facilitated ways, find ways to share that with one another. So identity is actually a very important part of culture, and it's often the majority group, majority ethnic group, which may not have done this in the past and may not be doing it in the present, because culture is understood in terms of the majority group. And that's often down to language, dress, the food we eat, how we understand one another, the ways we have meetings, some of the areas that Pat was already speaking about. Maybe Pat may say a little more about this, but you've raised, a number of you have raised the matter of history. How do we understand ourselves historically and what's gone before us? the work that I'm doing with religious orders generally, this is fairly constantly coming up. That there have been issues in the past that are still with us in the present and are preventing us really from moving on in mission as we could, as the Spirit is calling us. It seems to me that work still needs to be done in the area of sharing and trying to address some of the matters that have historically hurt us. It may have hurt some of us who are present now. It may have hurt some of us who are now dead, but the legacy of hurt continues on. So some sense of ability, and this is very difficult in some cultural circumstances and in some congregations, but in religious life, we are often called to do difficult things. Difficult does not stop us. That we look back together to try and understand some of the situations of the past, and we actually invent rites of reconciliation and healing within our groups, with a view to us then hearing more fully the call of the Spirit and responding. So that's at least an answer to a few of those matters. Might I then hand over to my esteemed colleague on my left.
And in a way that links with the question about right relationship, because right relationship is with myself, with the other, with the whole of creation, and with our Creator God. And the right relationship is, in a sense, an understanding and love of myself and an understanding and love of the other. I mean, I love the quote that Tim used, we must first love my brothers and sisters. And out of that love comes a desire to know the other better, but equally in getting to know the other better, one learns to love at a deeper level. I think naming the blocks, be they present or past, takes skilled facilitation and help. And sometimes we're able to do it for ourselves, and sometimes we have to avail of outside facilitators, somebody who can help us design a process. But sometimes the area of concern becomes actually very like a boil. It becomes very visible and we know we have to attend to it. Or it's something that keeps resurfacing within a congregation. And in looking at the historical story, I remember having an experience of doing a timeline of the congregation from an exercise, having a large sheet of paper starting at the foundation up to today, and looking above the line, looking at significant dates, putting them on the line, and then inviting those, I think it might have been a provincial or a general chapter, and inviting those present, or it could be for any meeting, to name where were the joys, the joys along the journey, and where were the shadows. And then looking at where were the shadows that had been attended to, and that were still, and that had been in a sense healed, or where were the shadows that had been partially attended to or not attended to at all, and that were impacting life today. So doing some sort of external exercise like that, facilitated, can actually help help surface the areas that we need to attend to. And I've, like Tim, I believe that naming and then calling for, and again, this is a time rhythm. sometimes we expect we can do this in a day. It may be a process over a year within a congregation, or it may be a shorter process at community level. But that we look at the historical roots of some of the issues or the areas that need attention. And that we do that reflection and discernment at an individual level and at a group level. So where have I, in a sense, where have my prejudices or my stereotypes or my failures, where are they located? Sometimes it's in ignorance. I just didn't know. I didn't understand the dynamics of culture. I didn't realize how what to me was normal to somebody else was offensive. So and that happens at the personal level or kind of at an institutional level. And I do think there's a need to ritualize healing. Within my particular congregation, at one chapter, we ritualized if you like, we had a healing ritual to name and claim the hurts of the past within the historical story of the congregation. And I think that went a way towards healing of past hurts. Because, people, that phrase there, people who are not responsible, people here today may not be responsible. But the line from scripture that says the sins of the fathers and mothers are visited. It goes to the next generations and beyond. And in a way, the healing source maybe is in the next generations. I can think of examples where hurts of the past, even congregational separations, have been healed down the line by the next generations who have a different approach.
Grazie.
Thank you, team. Thank you, Pat. Thank you for having participated and for having had patience with us. Thank you for having followed us also online. As I said before, over this year we will continue working on this thing, and we will also try to value questions, because questions always arise reflection also for them. Our next meeting on interculturality will be on March 24th with Sister Chinika Eziani, a sister from Nigeria who wrote a text regarding interculturality in religious life. So we are going to present it online and here, and we will send you all information. But as you know, so for March 25th, we will, 24th. Well, you are very careful in listening. So on March 24th, we will organize maybe an online or even a face-to-face meeting. I don't know. I know that many sisters like to be here during meetings, so it is very nice for us because this is your space. I believe that we gave you a lot of material. We want to thank you before closing. So Sister Therese was saying, so here we have an event for UISG again. This will take place on February the 1st, only in Spanish. It has been organized by the Education Commission, by UISG and USG to reflect upon the theme of education with this movement Fe y Alegría within the Jesuits. So thank you. So this is very important. On March 18th, we will organize an event dedicated to women who, through their action, being religious or lay, empower other women. We will organize it here and also online, because this is the way in which we will celebrate the Women's Day, not in a revenge-like way, but to highlight the beauty of the action of women inside the church in the world. Last thing, for legal matters, I took some pictures and shot some videos of you while you were talking. These videos will be put in our YouTube channel, so I'm going to ask you that whoever doesn't want to be visible in photos and videos, could you please raise your hand so that we can cover the pictures. So whoever doesn't want to appear in photos or videos, could you just raise your hand? Thank you. So let's work for us. We will send you the videos, the registered videos in 4 languages, and even the presentations by Sister Pat and Sister Tim. No, pardon. Well, some professional problems that you can share with your communities. Thank you. Have a nice evening.